Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. This is Lunchtime Live. I am Chip Gibbons, the Policy Director for Defending Rights and Dissent. I'm very excited today because I'm joined by Baynard Woods and Brandon Soderberg, who are the authors of a new book, I Got a Monster, The Rise and Fall of America's Most Corrupt Police Squad. And it is a book I cannot recommend more highly. It is well written. All of the people in it are real, and they come across with a real depth in the book, and it's just a shocking story of police corruption. I first heard of the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force back in November 2017. I believe it was slightly before Thanksgiving, when there was an incident where a Baltimore police officer was shot while on duty. There was a manhunt, as there is when a police officer is killed. And it came out very quickly that the very next day he was supposed to have been testifying before a federal grand jury about this corruption in this Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force. His death was later ruled a suicide, even though it was initially believed to be a homicide. Not to go into the conspiracy hour, but I believe a lot of people in Baltimore, including his family, are unsatisfied with that explanation, to put it mildly. It's just a really, really great book. I used to do police accountability stuff in Baltimore, so I thought I knew how bad the Baltimore police were. But thanks to Baynard and Brandon's book, I apparently didn't even know a tenth of it. So let's get started with the most obvious question: who were the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force, and why do you consider them to be the most corrupt police squad in America?
I'll take the first part of that, Baynard, and then you can launch the argument for why they're the most corrupt. The Gun Trace Task Force was a plainclothes police squad of 7 officers who were federally indicted on March 1st, 2017. They were indicted for racketeering conspiracy charges. Essentially, they were charged by the federal government as police, as if they were a gang, which they basically were. They were robbing people, they were stealing drugs, they were redealing drugs, they were planting evidence, and they were stealing a ton of overtime and routinely, nightly violating Baltimoreans' constitutional rights, especially their Fourth Amendment rights. So that's the basics of it. I think when Baynard, you can explain why they're the most corrupt. I think that kind of colors in the rest of these guys.
I mean, it's important to note also that in addition to being the most corrupt, they were praised police officers. They were widely rewarded, promoted, advertised by the police department through Facebook and other social media posts. Look at all the guns we're getting off the street and stuff. So they weren't just criminals. They aren't just bad apples. They were also decorated police officers. And we argued that they were the most corrupt. I mean, we hesitated because America to people other than here means beyond the United States. And so we didn't, but our publishers didn't want to say in North America. So with caveats for other places, the amount of corruption within that single squad, they were all doing their own corrupt activities, stealing and dealing drugs, the stuff Brandon was talking about before they came together. And so when they came together, it was like the super group of grimy cops who were then, 3 different ones had their own separate drug dealers that were dealing drugs they were stealing or that they were protecting. And one of those was also a cop in Philadelphia that was selling drugs taken off the street in Baltimore to people in Philadelphia.
It's such a bonkers story. I mean, every page of this book, I think it can't get any worse. And there's another incidence of just, I mean, corruption seems quite mild to describe what they were doing. One of the most shocking stories, though, is one in which one of the officers plants drugs at the scene of a car crash. Could you talk about what happened there?
Yeah, so it was back in 2010. And one thing important to note, it's before they were called the Gun Trace Task Force. So some people want it to be this particular unit. But like I said, they were all being corrupt in a wide variety of previous units that had different names. So they started chasing. They pulled up on a man named Umar Burley who was driving, and his friend Brent Matthews sitting in the car, and tried to block him in. They said that the cops jumped out wearing masks and pulling guns on them. They thought they were being robbed, and so they fled. That caused a car crash. They ran into a man named Elbert Davis, and Davis died. Burley, then they didn't have anything on them, so Jenkins, Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, who's the head of the gun trace task force, when they were indicted, he called a sergeant up, had that sergeant come and bring an ounce of heroin that they planted in Burley's car, which then ended up, they were able to say that he was running from being arrested for that. And one of the other cops who was in the car with Wayne Jenkins is the one that you mentioned earlier, Chip, is Sean Suter, the homicide detective who was shot in the head right before Thanksgiving of 2017. And I just want to say one thing about that. He wasn't, an independent investigative board ruled it a homicide, but a suicide, but the medical examiner still rules it as a homicide. So we can talk more about that later, but he was involved in that, and that was the event that he was going to testify about to the grand jury the next day.
I mean, friends of mine in Baltimore frequently bring up that incident when talking about the police in their city. And the reason why I remember it was before Thanksgiving, because I remember having Thanksgiving dinner with my very conservative, very pro-cop family. And even they were like, there is something here with this guy dying. So why don't you tell us about that incident now, since we brought it up? Let's get into it now.
You want to take that, Brandon?
Yeah. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one way to look at it is that something we wrote and were observing when we were reporting on at the time before we started the book really was that there was a way in which the people on the street and police sources were saying a lot of the same things about this death, which was that it was a homicide, that it was someone shot him, not that he shot himself. Then the suicide theory kind of came in, as you said earlier, Chip, his family in particular has called it an inside job. The one other thing I'd say that we really observed doing reporting was that when you spoke to people in Baltimore, nearly everyone seems to think it was police that killed him. And in particular, the kind of idea that it was a random shooting or some big bad drug dealer shot a police officer really didn't parse with what we heard and what makes sense when you understand the underground economy. Because as you mentioned, that area was like completely shut down. Baynard and I drove over there a few times. I was over there within, I think about 20 minutes of that happening. And you just saw a full lockdown, a full kind of police state in the neighborhood. And so the idea that maybe someone involved in the drug trade would shoot a cop, which just sort of brings a lot of police into your neighborhood and prevents you from being able to deal drugs, is really something that I find particularly hard to believe. So I think it really is kind of, you either fall on the side of suicide or homicide, in that it's something to do with the fact that he was going to testify. So,
like I said, there's so many shocking stories in this book. Which was the one that shocked you the most about what this gang was up to?
It's hard to say what's most shocking, because the trial, when we were sitting there in the trial every single day, sort of like you said with each page, it was some jaw-dropping detail after another, faking video evidence, stealing $100,000, faking video evidence. So when we heard about these kinds of things, it was just, but I think later on it was some of the smaller, pettier things that really, like they stopped this guy. They seem to have planted a gun on him. He claims they planted a gun on him. They took his phone and they were trying to act like they were him to get his girlfriend to send information, to say something incriminating. And when she didn't, they started trying to get her into sending nude pictures, pretending that they were him. And they would steal $100,000, but they also, he robbed a stripper in the parking lot of a strip club. They robbed a homeless man of money that he had in his sock. And so the just war footing that they had against everyone, that everyone in the city, every Baltimorean was an enemy, collectively was the thing that was so seemed so shocking, I think.
I mean, and the one stole pharmaceuticals during the Freddie Gray uprising. I remember there was a big sort of moral panic about all these missing pharmaceuticals, and I was reading your book, and it turned out it was one of the Baltimore Gun Task Force members stealing Cialis, which was not the way we heard the story at the time. And I believe he got a medal for his other actions that day. Is that correct, or am I imagining that?
Yeah. No, Sergeant Jenkins, the kind of criminal mastermind behind the task force, was given a Bronze Star for his bravery on the day of the rioting that took place on part of the uprising, because he saved a few officers who'd been hit by bricks and were kind of abandoned. As described, he commandeered a van and picked them up and took them out of danger. And then that night, he looted the looters and waited around pharmacies and took bags of drugs from people and took them to his cocaine dealing friend out in the county. And then they sort of went through the pills, tried to see what they could sell, which, as you said, Chip, turned out to not be a lot of like serious pain pill kind of things, but a lot of Cialis and things like that, which they still ended up selling.
Yeah. So, as you said, they were decorated cops at the same time they were criminals. So one of the more interesting aspects of this book to me is someone who is quite concerned about surveillance and is very critical of the types of surveillance, video surveillance you see with like the Baltimore City Watch surveillance, is the way the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force actually interacted with video surveillance. When you're discussing sort of the expansion of surveillance cameras in Baltimore in your book, you write, for a good cop, it was like a totalitarian fantasy that allows you to see everything. For a dirty cop, that kind of surveillance was a dystopian field of unseen eyeballs, always watching, waiting to take you down. Could you talk about sort of the relationship between the men on this task force and video surveillance? I know you also mentioned that they fabricated video evidence as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. Especially when Jenkins, he kept getting, as the city has increased its camera surveillance, it kept snaring him up in cases. So the first time he really got caught on camera was in 2008. They busted into a bar, locked everyone in it, and then illegally searched everyone. And it turned out the bar had security camera. So the people in the bar brought a suit against Jenkins and some other officers who have since been charged in connection with this as well, and they were all convicted. They lost the civil suit, but there was a $1 award given to the plaintiff. So it's just like not taking the rights of people seriously. The second time in 2014, as they increased the cameras, the City Watch cameras tremendously, he wasn't aware there was one when they stopped a man named Walter Price, and Walter Price was. They thought he was going to deliver a half ounce of cocaine to someone because of a setup they'd done. He knew they were on him, so he'd left it at the house. They went to his house apparently and got the same cocaine that had been in the house and planted it in his van later. And a defense attorney noticed that there was something wrong on the video, pointed it out to the prosecutor. It went all the way up, and it came the closest that Jenkins came to being derailed by having that video showing. Only though that he had lied in what he said had happened in the statement of probable cause, but it caused IED complaints. They were maybe going to try to indict him, and then nothing happened with that. Powerful people stepped in. But he was, I think body cameras are 99.99% of the time just used as surveillance tools against the defendant.
Yes.
And don't do what we really, people were sort of arguing they would do. But it was clear that these particular cops were worried about stealing on the street because of camera. The very first time, the first day one of them has a camera on, they don't turn it on until after the stop has been made. And then he doesn't know how to turn it off, and they inadvertently film themselves breaking into the guy's house. And so, it did worry them in terms of their illegal activity, but it didn't worry them at all in terms of violating people's rights, particularly.
So how did they fabricate video evidence?
So the way they did that was that they did a lot of that before they had body cameras, but when they had, when they were there was more of an attention on the police and having evidence and video evidence. So what they would do is they would record recreations of things or different versions of things they just did. So with their cell phones. So the most kind of notable one, and also it's sort of this video is online here and there, is that they robbed a man for about more than $100,000 and stole 2 kilograms of cocaine from him. When they after they did that, they left some of the money in the safe. They closed the safe. They turned one of their cell phones on and recorded as if they were opening the safe and discovering the cash for the first time. And what you see in the video footage is you see them performing the act of the cop that does the good job. Okay, no one touch it, call evidence, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, it was all kind of a ruse to cover that up. There's also examples of them recording people kind of under duress, including sort of beating people up, doing police brutality, and then putting the person on camera and having them say on camera, "I was not beaten up by the police." So things like that are really prevalent. So that's another way they're able to use and manipulate footage, which then goes to a prosecutor who sort of sees it as good policing. Look, they went above and beyond. They recorded themselves opening the safe. We didn't ask them to do that. They made sure to verify that this gentleman was not beaten up by police, even though he had just been beaten by police moments before they started recording.
Yeah, it was just really I keep saying over and over again, it's very shocking. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's just really very shocking contact. So what ultimately brings about the downfall of the Gun Trace Task Force?
It's ironically not the Department of Justice civil rights investigation, which they're doing on the Baltimore Police Department. It's not any of the things that we would think. It was, in fact, ultimately and defense attorneys had been the only one of the big points we try to make in the book is how defense attorneys were screaming about this and no one was paying attention until finally the FBI and the DEA are working with local county cops, trying to help them trace heroin that's causing overdoses in the county back to the city. So they're, these joint task forces and stuff, and they get a wire up on a phone. That phone then makes a call eventually to Mamadou Gondo, one of the officers in the Gun Trace Task Force, who was working with this drug crew. Gondo and his friend Kyle Wells and another one of the cops had also just done a home invasion and robbed a guy and forgot and left the GPS tracker under the car of that guy. And there's already a police GPS tracker underneath. They traced that back to another guy, the only GTTF member who wasn't charged. So between those two things, the federal story has honestly never quite made sense exactly how their pieces fit together. We have some skepticism about the way they say that it happened. But between those two things, they got a wire on Gondo's phone and ultimately in his car. And almost immediately they noticed that whenever on the nightly that they were stealing drugs from people that they stopped. And they thought, wow, this is something bigger than we thought.
Yeah, and I know in your book you focus in on a particular defense attorney, Ivan Bates, who I wish we had an entire day just to talk about him, because he is a fascinating figure. But for the victims of the Gun Trace Task Force, did any of them ever see any kind of justice?
That's hard to say. In a way, I think what happened to a lot of the people in this story, the damage is irreparable. And I think a lot of them did feel something resembling justice when they saw these officers being indicted, when they saw them taken out of the internal affairs building of the police department in handcuffs. I think that some people, although defense attorneys think way more, people should have gotten out because of the result of the task force, but there was sort of a review of cases. And so some people felt some degree of justice. There's also been a series of civil lawsuits related to them that has started to give victims of the task force money. But I think that what you also see when you speak to a lot of the people who were victimized by the task force is their sense is that it's bigger than these 7, or even bigger than the now 15 or so that have been caught up in these federal charges, and that there's something kind of frustrating about that for a lot of victims, that it almost feels like there's a way of trying to isolate the corruption and suggest that it's all over, when some of these victims will say, hey, what about this other officer that wasn't indicted on that day that was also there when I was robbed, et cetera, et cetera. So there's kind of this tension between something resembling justice. I think some people certainly felt encouraged when 2 of them who didn't plead guilty were found guilty, but that's still pretty limited. So I think justice for a lot of these people has not yet arrived.
So I guess let's end with sort of the big picture question. You start your book by stating Baltimore almost had a revolution. This is in reference, of course, to the uprising that took place after the police killed Freddie Gray back in 2015. 5 years later, we are once again witnessing an uprising. This one is fairly nationwide in response to the long-stemming issues of police brutality, police violence, and how those intersect with our long history as a nation of white supremacy. We see activists calling for things like defunding the police, which is perhaps the demand most associated with the current wave of resistance. How does the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force fit into our larger conversation about policing in this country? Are they just a group of extreme dirty cops that are a sort of anomaly? Are they part of a larger system that we should be concerned with? How do we think about them in light of our current moment?
I mean, one of the things that we have to offer from Baltimore is seeing the way that police respond to anti-police uprisings, and having, for us, been able to spend the last 5 years looking at that. And they turned the police department into a counterinsurgency, part of whose purpose was to thwart every kind of reform. So like we were talking about, you want body cams, we'll falsify body camera stuff. And they were very angry at the prosecutor, Marilyn Mosby, which created this kind of, on the surface, created this kind of smoke screen with their charges regularly. And Mosby wasn't doing anything about these cops because they were hard chargers. And so one of the main things that every time they made as many as 50 unconstitutional stops a night and robbed people. And this created a great deal of crime. And that creation of crime ensured more overtime for them and ensured that our city turned away from calling for changes to the police department to, hey, get the guns off the street. And it re-empowered the police department. And so we don't think that they're just bad apples. We think they're the logical extension of policing and of police seeing themselves as a particular kind of class, and then a particular extension of whiteness, that the law is intended to protect us, not to govern us. And they're an extreme version of that. I don't know if you want to add to that, Brandon.
Yeah, I'll go kind of more micro. I mean, something I've really stressed is that when you see police officers doing the kinds of things they're doing right now, which is not only what we saw with the Gun Trace Task Force sort of acting as a counterinsurgency after an uprising, but the kind of wild and egregious behavior seen from police officers during this uprising right now, people should really realize that the officers that are doing that are probably doing other things. For example, with the Gun Trace Task Force, Chip, you mentioned Sergeant Jenkins looting the looters and stealing drugs during the uprising. We also, two of the other officers that have been indicted, Daniel Hersl and Keith Gladstone, were rather famously did police brutality during the uprising. Hersl attacked a reporter named Ford Fisher, and is seen on plenty of video running around enforcing the curfew by finding anyone that's out on the street and throwing them against the wall, beating them up. With Keith Gladstone, rather famously, he grabbed a man by the dreadlocks, man named Larry Lomax, and slammed into the ground in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue and North Avenue, live on TV. And Keith Gladstone was one of the sort of second wave of indictments. He got indicted for, among other things, helping to plant a BB gun on someone that another one of these officers ran over. So I just say that when you think about the police you're seeing that are pepper spraying people and throwing people to the ground and all these horrible things, we should be catching those officers doing that. But we should start to really flag those as officers, that if they feel okay doing that on camera, you can only imagine what they're doing when they're not on camera.
Yeah, and I guess my final question is going to go in a bit of a different direction. You were both at the Baltimore City paper, which was a great alternative weekly that is now no longer with us. I know, Baynard, when you and I first met, you were at The Real News. What is the role of independent and alternative media in exposing these types of stories?
That's a great question, too. I think part of it is we were freer at the city paper. And the daily papers, they love documents, which leads them down the trap of doing a lot of police say type journalism that it's one of the few areas, that and reporting on development, where you can cite a single source and you don't ever have to follow back up. Was this person convicted? Did these charges stick? Or did you ever build this ridiculous project you say you're going to build? And it's the two worst kinds of reporting generally at daily papers because of that. And in independent media, you're more free to be able to, defense attorneys were always our way into it, being able to talk to them and then trying to seek out the people who have been incarcerated. Like, why would you not get the other side of the story? And people are so resistant to that in the mainstream press, that we felt that working for alternative papers and other alternative outlets, that was something that we were really able to do there that maybe the bosses and editors wouldn't allow at a more, organization-oriented place.
And I would just add that, it also, because we were focusing on the community, you were hearing more, the stories often start with the community, and so you're responding to what people are telling you or showing you sometimes. Literally, in this case, sometimes we were sent a video by one of the victims of the task force, Hersl, that showed a safe, the safe had been broken into. And so we had the ability to believe and understand these victims and dig into that deeper. But we also had a sense that I think the community somewhat distrustful of media, including two white guys that work for city paper. But we were able to build trust with them in a way that I think generally corporate and mainstream media isn't going to do, because it just doesn't have the community's interests at heart ever. It's just not interested in that. And so that ability to sort of talk to people and approach it from that perspective, I think also really helped us. And that's just something that you can't get with daily news or corporate news.
Thank you so much for joining us. The book is I Got a Monster, The Rise and Fall of America's Most Corrupt Police Squad. It's available now from St. Martin's Press. I cannot recommend it enough. I would encourage you to read it. And if you enjoyed this, I would also encourage you to check out Defending Rights in Dissent ongoing podcast on the FBI called Still Spying, which you can find at stillspying.org. Our most recent episode dealt with the assassination of Fred Hampton, and we brought on a guest who knew Hampton in life, who recounts the night he learned of the raid, and also was instrumental in exposing the FBI's role in his death. Future episodes are going to deal with FBI complicity with the Ku Klux Klan. It's a great series. It runs through November. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good day.